It's really, the title is From Crisis to Conflict Resolution, Keeping the Uncertainty Alive. It's important that we speak openly and honestly about crisis and about conflict. And it's also important that we have an understanding about the role that uncertainty plays in conflict resolution. No, that's okay. This is fine. And particularly with regard to what happens inside the human brain. Uncertainty is at the heart of every conflict, and it's at the heart of every crisis. And while the pursuit of certainty is important in every art and science, so is the preservation of uncertainty. There was an interview many years ago with Jean Genet, and the interviewer decided that she wanted to find out a little bit about him as a human being. So she asked him what seemed to be a fairly innocent question. She said, if your house was burning down and there was one thing that you could save from your house, what would you save? And he said, why, the fire, of course. And the idea of preserving the fire is important to us because what it preserves is a quality of life that it is too easy for us to ignore or suppress. So it's important for us to preserve uncertainty. And the question really, I think, for all of us is why? I think the first answer has to do with the fact that it is a part of the nature of the universe as a whole. That is, I think all of you are aware of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which basically describes how at a certain level of physical existence, very, very small, uncertainty is a given. It's an automatic and inevitable part of any description of physical reality. And I'd like to show you, you've heard of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but I'm not sure that you've actually seen it. So this is what it actually looks like, at the risk of shocking psychologists considerably. Here's what it looks like. The second one is written by Heisenberg himself, and the second was written by two people who followed Heisenberg and reformulated it. And here's basically what it says, if I can translate it. It says that whenever you are trying to measure something that is a duality, such as position and momentum that exist in relationship to each other, that if you either take a look at the change, that's the delta, in the position multiplied by the momentum of a particle, there is going to be a given level of uncertainty, and here's what it is. At the Planck level, which is what h means, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. So it's a decimal point, 33 zeros, and a 1. At that level, divided by 2 multiplied by pi times also the square root of minus 1. Isn't this bizarre? What happens is that you cannot any longer determine where something is. So just the presence of any elementary particle is something that is a little cloudy, a little uncertain. This is not because our instruments are not precise enough. It's because the electron does not actually have a precise location. And I'm mentioning this even though it's at a tiny, tiny level, because I'd like to use it as a metaphor for describing what happens in conflict resolution, which is something a little bit similar. And I think that those of you who are psychologists, I assume that is most of you, have a sense that emotion is a little bit like this. And even if we think of emotion as a waveform, similar to the wave of an electron or an elementary particle, the wave function of one of those elementary particles, we can still see that there is an element of uncertainty about any precise description of what it is that we're what we seek to describe. But I'd like to take it even one step further and suggest that if we think of the problem as a paradox, as an enigma, as something that actually has two correct answers, at least, then what happens is we are stuck with trying to solve a paradox by reducing it to a single correct answer. I'm going to come back to this one. This is a quotation from Umberto Eco from Foucault's Pendulum, a nice novel that he wrote. And he says, in his early days, he believed that the source of enigma was stupidity. In other words, we just didn't understand enough about the problem. I decided that the most terrible enigmas are those that mask themselves as madness. But now I have come to believe that the whole world is an enigma, a harmless enigma that is made terrible by our own mad attempt to interpret it as though it had an underlying truth. So here's the difficulty, and it's a difficulty in particular with regard to the law, and more broadly, it's a difficulty every time we confront something that is uncertain, something that has double messages or two truths, something that is paradoxical, something that is enigmatic, and seek to reduce it to a single truth. And what happens when that takes place is that we do, in fact, on some level, make it terrible. And we can now realize that the project of all dictatorships is to eliminate uncertainty, to eliminate paradox and enigma by giving a single correct answer to a question that has more than one answer. So the question, if the question is, for example, what books in literature have had an impact on you, the number of possible answers is infinite. But if we try to answer the question, what is the most important book ever written, we will have created a question that has a terrible answer because it will draw people into conflict with each other over a question that doesn't have a single correct answer. So why exactly, and I think we can go even further than this and say that if we look at the natural world, we can see that conflict and crisis emerge as natural systems approach phase transitions. That is a fundamental change, a fundamental shift. And there is a Nobel Prize-winning biologist whose name is Ilya Prigogine, who wrote a book called Order Out of Chaos, in which he describes the ways in which, for example, anything changes into something else and undergoes a phase transition. And as it does so, it enters what is called criticality. And in the stage of criticality, what happens is that what are called emergent phenomena begin to arise out of the crisis itself. Things that no one could have imagined beforehand. There is nothing in water that gives it the knowledge that it may soon become ice. And yet this self-organization of water emerges in the period of criticality precisely out of this uncertainty that actually determines at what point the water is going to transition into being ice. It's not a given, and it's not entirely certain, because of minor impurities that are in the nature of water. So this is a scientific description of a problem, but again, if we think of this as a metaphor for what happens in conflict resolution, here's the outcome. everybody in conflict undergoes a phase transition. Everybody who is in conflict, who emerges at the other end of it with some form of resolution, undergoes some kind of transformation. Where did that come from? The answer, I believe, is out of the uncertainties that they began with. The areas where they weren't entirely clear about what the answer was. Where, in other words, it is likely that there were two correct answers. So if we think about solving a problem that is a paradox, we can see that there are a number of shifts that take place in what Joan and I refer to in a book that we wrote called The Art of Waking People Up as paradoxical problem solving. We have to shift from eliminating problems to discovering them. But our natural tendency as human beings is to try to eliminate problems, to overcome them, to battle them, as opposed to discovering and actually being thrilled that we have discovered some problem, because it's an opening to some potential transformation. Instead of focusing on competency, to focus on learning and improvement. And this is important for us as mediators. Instead of deciding, is someone competent as a mediator, how about instead saying, how can we help people to learn more about conflict? How can we help them improve? A shift from blaming, cynicism, reactivity, and passivity to responsibility, trust building, proactivity, and prevention. So part of the human dilemma is that we are very quick to ascribe blame for things that happened. But there's a fundamental truth that when we reach it, finally stops us from doing this. And the fundamental truth is this: it doesn't matter whose end of the boat is sinking. Okay? If we're in the boat together, it can be your end or my end, but we have to pull together. And this is our planet. And the conflicts that we have are our conflicts. And we need to pull together to try to overcome them.